Lorsqu'en 2016, Donald Trump accède pour la première fois à la Maison-Blanche, les vaincus troquent bientôt leur stupeur initiale contre deux types d'interprétations. Pour les uns, le succès du magnat de l'immobilier procède d'une révolte, certes mal dirigée, contre l'ordre néolibéral des décennies précédentes. Tout milliardaire qu'il est, le candidat républicain aurait réussi à galvaniser ceux qu'on appelle les perdants de la mondialisation, en leur promettant tout à la fois de relocaliser les industries, de fermer les frontières aux travailleurs migrants et de venger le peuple des humiliations infligées par les élites culturelles. À l'inverse, les tenants de la seconde interprétation insistent plutôt sur les continuités entre la nouvelle administration et celles qui l'ont précédée. Car derrière les postures populistes de Donald Trump, la fiscalité régressive et la déréglementation des flux financiers sont plus que jamais à l'ordre du jour. Loin du changement radical annoncé, on n'assisterait qu'au ravalement de façade d'un capitalisme ébranlé par la crise de 2008. Aux yeux de l'historien canadien Quinn Slobodian, la thèse d'une rupture avec le néolibéralisme n'est pas fondée. Pour autant, il se garde bien de sous-estimer la nouveauté représentée par le trumpisme. Son attention se porte en effet sur les mutations internes au néolibéralisme, dont le second mandat de Donald Trump est aujourd'hui l'aboutissement. C'est que pour lui, néolibéral n'est pas le nom d'une doctrine économique fixée dans le marbre et attachée à la libre circulation des facteurs de production. Il y voit plutôt l'expression changeante d'un souci persistant, celui de sanctuariser la rentabilité du capital, en la préservant des menaces auxquelles l'exposent les manifestations de la souveraineté populaire. Ainsi, après la crise de 1929, les néolibéraux se sont surtout alarmés de l'essor des totalitarismes. Le nazisme et bien davantage encore, le communisme. Puis, dans les premières décennies d'après-guerre, leur inquiétude s'est déplacée vers le socialisme rampant, qu'ils associaient aussi bien au compromis social keynésien qu'à la décolonisation du Sud global. Pour autant, les penseurs néolibéraux que Quinn Slobodian décrit dans son livre « Les Globalistes » n'ont pas plaidé pour le retour au laisser-faire d'avant 1914. Ils ont plutôt milité pour un redéploiement du pouvoir d'État et des règles du droit international destinées à prémunir les mécanismes du marché contre les demandes d'égalité susceptibles de les compromettre. Jusqu'à la fin de la guerre froide, les intellectuels dont Quinn Slobodian étudie la trajectoire demeurent relativement confiants dans la possibilité de discipliner les régimes démocratiques. En revanche, la chute de l'Empire soviétique les trouve paradoxalement un peu désenchantés, mais aussi plus ambitieux qu'auparavant. Désormais convaincus que la démocratie, même dûment corsetée, est incompatible avec l'épanouissement de la liberté telle qu'ils la conçoivent, certains d'entre eux, généralement qualifiés de libertariens, vont alors imaginer des solutions plus radicales. Les uns, dont Quinn Slobodian relate les aventures dans « Le capitalisme de l'Apocalypse », gagent l'avenir dont ils rêvent sur la multiplication de zones franches. Celles-ci sont tantôt constituées en cités-États souveraines et tantôt insérées dans le territoire d'États-nations existants. Mais dans les deux cas, l'important est que ces enclaves soient affranchies de toute forme de contrôle démocratique. Quant au protagoniste de Hayek's Bastards, le plus récent des livres de l'historien, c'est sur la réhabilitation de thèses que l'on croyait définitivement disqualifiées en matière de monnaie, d'intelligence et même de race qu'ils entendent construire une société imperméable aux revendications égalitaires. Longtemps, les bâtards de Hayek, dépeints par Slobodian, sont restés cantonnés dans les marges sulfureuses du monde académique. Reste que désormais, leurs disciples et leurs idées sont au cœur de l'appareil d'État de la plus grande puissance mondiale. C'est pourquoi il nous a semblé si important de demander à l'historien des mutations de la pensée néolibérale de nous éclairer sur la généalogie du trumpisme. Notre entretien avec Quinn Slobodian a eu lieu à Paris le 1er février 2025.
So we're speaking on February 1st, 2025, is that it? So that means that the Senate hearings for Trump's cabinet are not over, they're still in progress. However, the people Trump has picked reveal at least two things. First, that the Republican Party and the US government is firmly in the hands of the far right, but also that this far right is diverse and hardly homogeneous. So maybe the first thing we should do is, if you can give us an idea of who are the main families that you see that are going to vie for the favors, the good graces, and the ear of the president.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the cabinet choices that he's rolled out so far have shown us a couple of things. One, off the bat, is that this so-called national conservative wing of the MAGA coalition seems to actually be quite marginal. So the idea that the Trump-style republicanism would mean a sort of a return of power of workers, a form of redistribution without trade unions and somehow without the traditional welfare state, seems to have been kind of put out of commission. Antitrust and the crack-up of big tech monopoly is something that Biden was interested in, and some people thought the national conservative wing of the Trump coalition would also carry through. But right now it looks like that vision of kind of a post-neoliberal right has been shuttled off to the side. Mario Rubio, rather than having an economic position, has been placed as Secretary of State. So that leaves, I think, two main sort of parts of the coalition taking over the more important levers of power. One of them I think you could call kind of austerity-minded, traditional beltway libertarianism. So Russ Vought at the Office of the Budget and Brendan Carr at the head of the Federal Communications Commission are people who have kind of come out of the ecosystem of libertarian think tanks and have the old vision of the need to just slash budgets, cut state spending, remove oversight, remove regulations, make things easier for states to make themselves look differently, compete for mobile investors, and to basically grease the wheels of, profit accumulation for big corporations. The energy vision is very similar too, right? Roll back any kind of climate legislation, roll back commitment to renewable energy, and let it rip with oil extraction, fracking, and liquid natural gas production. So that part of the coalition is, in a way, a kind of extension of the Reagan model of conservatism, libertarianism, neoliberalism, free market, fundamentalism, choose your term. But that has been a kind of pipeline of policy from think tanks to GOP legislators for decades now. The more interesting, I think, part of the coalition is the one coming from the West Coast of the United States, from Silicon Valley, who traditionally have been either partial to the Democrats or more likely kind of opting out of traditional party politics altogether and taking a position of suspicion to what was sometimes called the paper belt of Washington, New York, and Boston, defunct dinosaurs out on the East Coast who are now being replaced by Facebook, Uber, PayPal, Bitcoin, and so on. The notable or the novel part of the new MAGA coalition is the appearance sort of on stage of the billionaires of Silicon Valley. In fact, the centibillionaires, right? The group of people who have over $100 billion, not just a mere $1 billion. So Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, Tim Cook are all now firmly not just supporters of Trump in some sort of passive or arm's length way, but are trying to be active players inside of the very practice of government. So the fact that David Sachs, a member of the PayPal mafia, will now have what looks like an appointment as the AI and crypto czar advising the White House. Elon Musk has an ambiguous, so far unconfirmed position as the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, but has as of the time of this interview, been very aggressive in trying to push through a policy that is not only kind of deconstructive or sort of austerity-minded, withdrawing state regulations, but is also at the same time, I think, trying to leverage parts of the government into specific forms of capital-intensive investment, from AI to self-driving cars to satellite technology to rocket technology. So there's a kind of curious combination of two versions of Republican politics here. On the one hand, old-fashioned, shrink the state. On the other hand, weaponize the state, plug into what Biden, I think, correctly called a tech industrial complex that might, more aggressively open up markets and push out the innovation frontier for cutting edge technology.
There's still another little wing that's very active, whatever their importance, who are the Thomas Homan and the Stephen Miller, the ethnic cleansers, basically. They seem to be doing relatively well de facto.
There are indeed. I mean, there are other people that I didn't name, for example, Chris Hegseth, who is now confirmed as Defense Secretary, one of the many television personalities who now has a central role in the government, who seems mostly interested in kind of cultural issues, worries about, I guess, the weakening of American masculinity, the parasitical presence of DEI hires inside of the military organization. So is seemingly dead set on kind of purifying the military into a more traditional, space of kind of male authority. What military overseas projects that will translate into, I think we're still trying to find out. But the ethnic cleansing wing, if you like, of the party, the Stephen Miller, Stephen Bannon faction, clearly has played a major role so far in the opening weeks of the administration. Very high profile and visible efforts of rounding up people, putting them on military planes for transportation back to their countries of origin. Extreme talk about ending birthright citizenship, which is a place that no previous Republican, no matter how radical, had gone before at the level of an executive order. And also nullifying legal residence of the United States. So people who had been given visas under Biden are now being told that those visas are no longer valid. So there is, clearly this effort at kind of radically transforming the border regime. Radically transforming might be too strong because, as we know, Obama and Biden were also epic deporters, but turning it into a kind of more arbitrary and extreme form of punishing opponents, regulating populations, and satisfying the voters that might have wanted to see some sadistic, cruelty as a reward for their vote.
So that would be the last remaining element of the wing that you think is a little bit in decline, which is the National Conservative.
Yeah, I mean, the National Conservative wing of the Republican Party, I think, was the one that promised something more like a Polanyian double movement. So this was a way that a lot of people have thought about politics, global and national, for the last couple of decades, is using the ideas that Karl Polanyi used in the Great Transformation. According to him, there was an effort to kind of disembed people from their home territory and turn them into commodities that could be bought on an open market. The victory of liberalism, what we would now call neoliberalism, had sort of uprooted people from the places they lived in and made them compete with other workers all over the world, and hired them and fired them as if they were not anything more than goods to be exchanged on an open market. Polanyi warned in the 1940s that there would be a double movement, so people would be disembedded from their home spaces and their home communities, but then there would be a second movement that would re-embed them. He thought that would be happening at the level of the nation, and he warned that it could come either from the left through a kind of a socialist politics of protection and care, or from the right as a fascist politics of protection and care. And I think in Trump 1.0, a lot of us a lot of intellectuals and academics were interpreting what was happening as a kind of a double movement from the right. It looked like an attempt to shield people from the violent disruptions of a globalized marketplace, to attend to them as workers and people suffering precarity and joblessness and homelessness. And there was an expectation that Trump-like politics would have some aspect of protection, care, redistributive policies. It didn't really pan out that way. We didn't get much of that in 1.0. There was thoughts that we would get some of that in 2.0 because of the presence of people like J.D. Vance, who uses the language of, a world after liberalism, Catholic values, traditional subsidiarity principles, community and care, and so on. Yet, I think what protection exists in the Trump vision has been sort of distilled down to just anti-immigrant violence. So that is, I think, like the last remaining part of what, we can expect from a double movement is, exaggerated punitive acts that are promised to create more job opportunities for the autochthonous native population, but won't necessarily produce those opportunities as envisioned.
So your work since Brexit and since Trump 1.0 has been informed by the claim that the so-called populist ascendancy on both sides of the North Atlantic should not be understood so much as a reaction against neoliberalism, but as a mutation of neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. You participated in a book called Mutant Neoliberalism, mm-hmm. So did I. Mm-hmm. So this notion of mutation and mutant neoliberalism, mm-hmm. I think, encapsulates your work in part mm-hmm. since 2016. Mm-hmm. So the question I want to get at, but mm-hmm. that's not the one I'm going to ask right now, mm-hmm. is what do the various Trumpist tribes that mm-hmm. you just described tell us about the continuities, but also the ruptures between the neoliberal world order that your book Globalist described mm-hmm. and the current mutant form? However, before getting to the substance of this mutation, I think it's important to dwell on what prompted it. Namely, the surprising post-Cold War blues mm-hmm. that was experienced by neoliberal intellectuals around the turn of the 1990s, mm-hmm. and something that you write about in the introduction of Hayek's Bastard, among other places. Mm-hmm. So my first question is why did the end of the Cold War cause more disappointment and concerns than elation in neoliberal circles?
Yeah, I mean, being a historian, I find it most helpful to kind of often pull back the lens and try to understand this in a kind of a longer perspective. And if you take that longer perspective, as I did in Globalists, and I continue to take in the recent books, I think that you see that neoliberalism is a kind of evolving project itself. And at any given moment, the primary enemies of neoliberalism are also different. So if you think about neoliberalism as a kind of ongoing project to protect capitalism from democracy, as I've theorized it, then the enemies and the threats to capitalism transform from decade to decade. For example, in the 1930s, the dangers for the market and for economic freedom came from the right in the form of fascism and from the left in the form of communism. After the Second World War, for people like Hayek, the threat was less the Soviet Union and more, as he called it in his preface to, or his dedication to the Road to Serfdom, the socialists of all parties, right. By which he meant the Labour Party, by which he meant the Social Democratic Party in places like Germany. So the welfare state and Keynesianism now became the kind of way that we could end up, nevertheless, on a slippery slope to serfdom, a road to serfdom. By the 1990s, of course, the Soviet Union is dead. Communism as an international movement is all but dead. And yet there are still threats to economic freedom, the most efficient allocation of goods through the price mechanism, and they've taken on a different guise. As the Mont Pelerin Society folks met as the wall was falling and the Soviet Union was crumbling, they were surprisingly having this sort of depressive conversation that it seemed that the victory had been won, and yet the enemy had actually mutated, and they used the term themselves. The enemy had gone from red, in many cases they said, to green. So environmental movements, which we must remember were quite powerful in the late 1980s, the effort to combat climate change was actually reaching a sort of a high point and never recovered, you could say, in the battle against CFCs and the response to the problem of the ozone layer. The primary enemy now of the market was less the old one of the militarized working class. The working class was also no longer believing in communism, according to them, but the new threat of an educated elite which was trying to push their values of environmentalism, feminism, anti-racism down the throats of average people, and to freeze up the institutions that are otherwise intended to protect the economy with all kinds of social justice demands that would later be called wokeism. So that conversation about culture war issues as the primary concern for neoliberals interested in defending economic freedom above all is not a recent issue. That goes back to the end of the Cold War. And in the process of sort of confronting the new challenge of the green enemy, the feminist enemy, the anti-racist enemy, they became concerned that the institutions that they had helped build and would hope would help to protect the market, things like the European Union, they worried these had become kind of Trojan horses for their enemies. So as strange as it might sound, given the rather moderate politics of someone like Jacques Delors and his own role in accelerating the creation of the common market and economic integration, they really believed that there was a kind of a social Europe that was going to be unrolled to squash the more economically austere and competitive-minded version of Europe that they hoped to preserve. So into the 90s, they saw new enemies. They felt that the state spending that they were opposed to was not actually rolling back. Entitlement programs like Social Security in the United States and other forms of the welfare state still meant that the state was spending a large portion of GDP itself on entitlement programs and the like. So the welfare state was still alive. Socialism was dead, but as they put it, Leviathan lives on. And now you needed kind of a new set of responses to fight the mutating enemy.
And there's another element that is both very strong in Globalist and in Hayek's Bastard, is two things. Is one, which ironically and is quite interesting, is the fact that, as you said, the main enemy, let's say from in the post-war era, was social democracy and Keynesianism. And so therefore they never put too much emphasis on the Cold War and on communism. On the other hand, what really upset them was the process of decolonization. And so you can say that in 1989, the elation, I mean, I'm just quoting you here, the elation of the end of communism was clearly superseded by the anxiety caused by the end of apartheid.
Some people definitely were worried about the kind of the rise of racial equality as something that would squash economic freedom, in the case of apartheid ending with one person, one vote equality. But I think they were also, in ways that are helpful, I think, for us to understand history better, more clued into what was happening in East Asia than a lot of mainstream Western intellectuals were. So the story I try to tell in Crack Up Capitalism is to try to bring in East Asia to the tableau of world events from the late 1980s to the present in a way that often we ignore it and talk about sort of a great confrontation, a clash of two ideologies represented by Moscow and Washington, with Europe trapped in the middle. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the totalitarian empire is dead, and all that we have left now is kind of American style hegemony, you know, like it or hate it, this is the only game in town. That, I would say, is the sort of broad version of world history that you get in high schools or colleges, or just picking up Time magazine or reading most New York Times op-eds for the last 30 or 40 years. But in the whole period under consideration, there was something else quite important happening in East Asia. There were new forms of politics in places like Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan. And there was, of course, the slowly evolving, then accelerating growth of China as an economic powerhouse. And what I try to show in the book is how neoliberals were tapped into that from quite early on. So they were more attentive, arguably, to what was happening in East Asia than what was happening in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, I think, in the end, was a kind of a sideshow. And they saw the sort of awakening economic power of China as something that was a new puzzle. Was it good or bad? Was it actually the forefront of a new kind of Hayekian neoliberalism? Unbelievably, I have people talking about experimentation inside of China in the 1980s as a kind of a more faithful version of Hayekian rationality than the European Union, with what they thought was the flattening out and squashing of efforts of innovation and risk-taking entrepreneurialism. So they, I think, had been oriented that way for a while. And where we are now, 2025, with the Trump administration, China is seen, I think, as the primary economic adversary that is challenging the United States either to emulate it and respond in kind, or produce some other kind of economic model in response. And much of the chaos, I think, in the United States politically now is an inability to decide how they should actually redesign themselves. Do they want to become another China, or is there still some kind of version of neoliberal political economy that can be salvaged to counter this threat?
So China was in a way a model before even becoming a rival, in a way, for them.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a reason why the Crack Up Capitalism book begins with sort of two people falling in love with Hong Kong at the same time. One is Milton Friedman, the other is Deng Xiaoping. Milton Friedman sees in Hong Kong a kind of container for global capitalism in a time of increased mobility of finance and the outsourcing of manufacturing that can pivot very quickly to new needs in the world market because of the lack of veto points, the lack of special interests, the lack of an electorate. The place could be governed like a startup, it could be governed like a firm, and therefore it could serve as an alternative to the problematic version of post-colonialism spreading across, sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of Asia, where independence politically was understood also as independence economically, and there was an unwillingness to totally transform economies according to the needs of global competition. Because Hong Kong, under colonial administration, was designed to always plug into where it could suit global needs best, it looked to Milton Friedman not like something from the past, a 19th century crown colony, destined for the dustbin of history, but a kind of a template for how polities could be designed in the future. Similarly, Deng Xiaoping saw Hong Kong as a model for gradually opening up the Chinese market, not all at once, not overnight, in the style of shock therapy, in which you introduce a free price system immediately and people just have to scramble to respond, but in small experimental islands along the southern coast, where you have the reintroduction of property markets, the reintroduction of hire and fire labor markets, the opening up to foreign investment and foreign ownership. And then you look, if it works well, you emulate it. If certain things don't work well, then you change when you create the next zone, a few miles up the coast. So this was very much, I think, the forefront of kind of innovation within the world of global capitalism in the post-1970s era. And indeed, I think for the more shrewd neoliberals, it was always the place that they were looking to as a kind of a laboratory for new fixes that were different than just creating one law for the world economy in the model of the World Trade Organization. I think that's been one of the big themes from globalists to crack up capitalism, is that if you're confronted with democracy as a problem, you have two ways of dealing with that problem. Either you scale up and build institutions, international investment law, international commercial codes, World Trade Organization, which can then constrain democracies and keep them on the tracks of competition and capital security and economic freedom. Or you can scale down and create opt-out enclaves, which can, operate beyond democratic accountability and control. And that, I think, pincher movement, where the nation exists between institutions above and kind of secessionist enclaves below, is much of where the kind of mutations of neoliberalism is traveling from one pole to the other.
So that's the model, I think, that you develop in Crack Up Capitalism, this idea that, going small instead of going bigger, going micro, poking in the system rather than global encasing through laws and rules and norms. In your even more recent work, Hayek's Bastard in particular, other elements of the mutation of neoliberalism seem to appear, right? Because for the neoliberal of the globalist era, the general idea was that capital goods, and to a lesser extent people, should be sort of free to circulate, and that you need some kind of a constitution of liberty to allow this to work without having to deal with governmental, especially national governmental overreach. That was. But then with the mutation, due both to the melancholy created by the end of the Cold War and the new excitement caused by the new possibility of East Asia, other things appear too, which I want to go one by one. The first one is the so-called racially realistic control of migrations and human capital management. The second one is the return of tariffs that we should talk about, and the strategic use of tariffs, certainly a taboo for the globalists, to reorganize trade around bilateral relations rather than big multilateral treaties. Then alternative ways of dealing with monetary inflation, which was also an obsession for neoliberals all along, but this time with a revamping of gold, strange thing, and of course the development of cryptocurrency more recently. And then finally, another thing that is interesting and very striking in Trump is the reinforcement of executive privilege, which of course predates Trump but is pushed to new levels, that seems to be taking the place of the legal encasement that you were talking about in globalism. So the idea is to go through these four transformations. And first, let's start with the hard borders. How did hard borders, but also racial discrimination based on IQ, but also selective natalism became integral parts of the mutating neoliberal regime?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally when people talk about the far right, one of the things they attribute to the far right is belief in the ethno-state, right? The idea that membership in the community should be defined according to some questions of heredity, bloodline, or nation, place of origin. And I think this is partially why the analysis of the far right is often mostly focused on questions of politics and culture rather than questions of economics, because it's seen to be almost an anti-economic logic. It's focused so much on these particularities, either scientifically based or more spiritually based, that supposedly bind a community of fate, as the Germans would call it, a Schicksalsgemeinschaft. What I write about in Hayek's Bastards is that some of the neoliberals and the libertarian-minded ingenues and kind of habitués of the financial world were drawn to hard borders not because they were attracted to some idea of the national essence or the importance of blood and soil, but because they were able to arrive at sort of exclusionary logics through an economic rationale themselves. So Peter Brimelow is the person that I focus in on Hayek's Bastards, who is one of the most famous nativists in the United States, is seen as one of the fathers of what is now the sort of Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller model of purifying the population and radically hardening the borders and reducing the paths to citizenship. Most people would see him as a classic kind of far-right believer in the ethno-state. And yet he arrived at that position through a completely economic lens. His argument was consistent with Milton Friedman's own argument, which is that you can either have a welfare state or open borders, but you can't have both. So if you continue to have a welfare state, then you are going to be drawing in the kind of people who are actually least capable of fending for themselves and are most liable to be parasitic on federal budgets. This was mapped for him onto a kind of hierarchy of cultural abilities and racial characteristics, meaning that he followed the work of IQ bad science to suggest that people from certain parts of the world, because they have lower IQ, have also a shorter time horizon, an inability to plan for the long term, and an inability to be entrepreneurial. Therefore, they were more likely to become welfare dependents. That was the logic drawn on by Richard Lynn, Charles Murray, Peter Brimelow, and in the German case, perhaps the most important intellectual source for the far-right Thilo Sarrazin.
Who was a member of the SPD.
Who started out as a member of the SPD and was also even a member of the board of the Bundesbank. So someone coming from a total economic rationality, arriving at an exclusionary hard borders policy on the basis not of a belief in, the Aryan race or the importance of thousands of years of German heritage, but because of the belief in the need to filter out likely welfare dependents based on a racial criteria and filter in likely productive members of society also based on a racial criteria, both mapped onto the bad science of IQ claims that intelligence was the most important indicator and it could help you make a kind of useful first stab at understanding who's going to be a good member of the economy and who's not going to be a good member of the economy. So that hard borders position can be justified on ethno-economic principles as well as ethno-state principles. And more, I think that's the way it's being defended by the sort of hard right neoliberals themselves. Now, there is another strain of this, which is more in the line of Murray Rothbard and the anarcho-capitalist wing of the hard right neoliberal coalition, which believes in hard borders because they believe in the idea of sort of entry by admission. So the idea of private gated communities that require a kind of proper payment to become part of them. Citizenship by investment would be a model of this. This idea of nations by consent, as Murray Rothbard talked about them in the 1990s, would embrace hard borders because it's a way of making sure that people who pay to be part of smaller communities are not being sort of invaded by freeloaders and people who would be otherwise not contributing to the value of the community itself.
So you mentioned Friedman and the use of Friedman, but there's also Hayek. Hayek, who was seen as sort of a Gentile globalist by excellence, but nonetheless, it's using or abusing Hayek through that this kind of re-racializing wing will come to the fore, and in fact, eventually become mainstreamed in a neoliberal circle. So,
I could talk about that.
Let's talk about
sure. So this is very interesting, right? Because Mises and Hayek Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek are both sort of the children of the Habsburg Empire. And one thing about the Habsburg Empire was that it was the biggest free trade zone in Europe when it existed, in which there was total free mobility of movement for capital goods and labor. The riddle that was sort of solved within the Habsburg Empire, according to von Mises, is that you had sort of one big economic unity, but then you also had ways to make people satisfied in terms of national self-determination. So if you had enough people of one language group, you could get money from the government to start up your own school. There was representation of different national groups within the Habsburg Empire, a kind of unity and diversity. And one of the story of globalists, in a way, is to the attempt to scale that up to the level of the world. So Mises himself was actually kind of a maximalist in terms of the free movement of labor. However, he, like Hayek, sort of conceded that there were all kinds of reasons of cultural mindset and cultural values that made it hard for people to accept the sudden arrival of a lot of people of a different racial background, ethnic background. I wrote an article about this with the title, Perfect Capitalism, Imperfect Humans, because they sort of left the door open for exclusion based on race and culture, not because of their economic theory, but as a kind of acceptance of the limits of human adaptability. So what began for Hayek as a kind of a footnote or an exception, he defended Margaret Thatcher's nativism on these grounds. People are not ready for it. It would be nice if they were, but they're not. Has then become the basis for more radical nativist neoliberals of saying this is an absolute rule. It's not an exception, something that may transform with time, but it's a starting point and also an end point. That racial homogeneity is actually a plus for the reduction of the kind of transaction costs within an economy. And we shouldn't accept this as a transitional period towards a future in which labor will be free and we will all live in a grand multiracial commonwealth underneath the sign of economic freedom, but that actually it's more like the long-term permanent arrangement, that we should create small racially homogeneous spaces because those tend to be more protective of the economic freedom principles we believe in. South Africa is a great example of this logic in action. In the 1980s, before Nelson Mandela was, the end story of South Africa, the bestseller in political terms, it was written by a white libertarian named Leon Lowe with the support of the Charles Koch Foundation. And his argument was not a rainbow democracy, multiracial universal suffrage, as happened in the 1990s, but he wanted to crack up the entire territory of South Africa into contractual communities, gated communities, in which you would have to pay for admission, and which white-dominated communities would live next to black-dominated communities. You would have a libertarian Bantustan next to a kind of a Maoist Bantustan. And his claim was this is a paradise of consumer freedom, vote with your feet, take the kind of world that you want to live in and choose it for yourself. But of course, in actuality, that would just reinforce and set more or less into legal stone the very racialized inequalities that apartheid was based on. So it's a kind of a wonderful version of sort of transforming the world to make it the same as it had been before, the kind of the leopard model, which suggests something to transcend apartheid, but is actually just a reconfiguration of it through a politics of crack up and fragmentation.
But the idea, the long run idea for them, is it every gated community and every Bantu stand for itself, and that would go against the free movement of capital because you want to block people, but you don't want to block capital. We'll get to goods later on. Or is it rationalized the way that you need the gated community to be well protected so that the wealth that it will produce will eventually trickle down to the world? How did they...
Yeah, there is no real sort of dream of trickle down, I would say. There is more a kind of resurrection, as I talk about in the book, quite literally, of the dream of the Middle Ages. So in the same way that Europe in the year 1000, which is a time and place that Hans Hermann Hoppe, one of my characters there, the heir of Murray Rothbard, will frequently refer to Europe in the year 1000 as a place you want to kind of get back to. Mm-hmm. What is it that attracts him about that? Well, Europe was a kind of shattered patchwork of many different jurisdictions, different kind of political arrangements, almost all hereditary, but some free cities, some sort of nascent versions of sort of merchant republics, but mostly duchies and princedoms and baronies and things like that. So you had, on the one hand, total political mishmash, chaos, but then you had a network of merchants who were able to move between all of those spaces and be sort of self-governed according to what was called the lex mercatoria, or the law merchant. So this vision of dividing and separating out sort of self-government in diverse fortified enclaves doesn't necessarily mean you're opting out of all the virtues of the free movement of goods or the division of labor even. It actually ideally combines sort of small-scale political self-government with total access to all of the fruits of the world through an itinerant merchant class, which then itself governs itself without the need of states. So they self-govern one to the other, protect contract, produce arbitration based on their own kind of professional code. So it's that duality which I think is a bit hard to grasp, but it works well if you think about it in terms of a Middle Ages model. Transposed to the 21st century, it becomes, annexed onto all of the new information and communication technologies which are available, which certainly give the fantasy of being able to be both totally isolated and yet totally plugged in to the world at the same time. So if you think about some of these people, especially in the Silicon Valley right, who live lives in which they are, sitting at a table or a desk and just with their phone, ordering everything they need, and it just magically appears. That's a good model of how you can be kind of both separate but hyperconnected at the same time. And that's the sort of prototype, I think, that doesn't make any promises about the rising tide eventually lifting all boats, or there being some like grand profit for the world's community in the long run. Those kind of utopian visions or promises have really vanished, I would say, from neoliberal rhetoric even. It's been reduced to a language of trying to get into the gated community so that you can protect yourself and your own, and creating a kind of profit center and insulating it from any attempts at seizure or redistribution by the useless surplus populations of the hinterland.
I understand, but you still would have two possible models. Mm-hmm. One model where only the people living in gated communities would be allowed to travel from Liechtenstein to Singapore and back, whereas the others wouldn't be able to travel. Or what you just said about Silicon Valley, where in fact you stay in your compound and you order things around, but that means then that, the brown people from Deliveroo are going to have to come and deliver the stuff, which kind of creates a danger for the gated community. So do they see it as we travel, they don't, or we don't need to travel because they bring
Well,
stuff?
I think it's a combination of both, right? I mean, we don't exactly have to project ourselves into a world of cyberpunk fantasy to imagine what you're describing. I mean, much of the world is organized exactly on this principle of, places that are organized more or less as compounds, where private security is provided. There is a kind of underclass that provides all of the kind of maintenance of everyday life, whether it's guarding the premises, doing the gardens, taking care of the kids, washing the toilets, who are watched over and are ejected at the end of the day, or else live in, places inside of the compound themselves. One of the things that is often occluded from the fascination with, say, the Dubai model or the Singapore model is these are places where the majority of residents in those two small places are not citizens at all, have no rights of citizens, and can be, fired and deported at any time, whether they're the domestics, taking care of the kids, or the people building the office towers. The vision of kind of crack up capitalism that I developed there is totally reliant on a surplus pool of labor that can be brought in and ejected at any given time. The fact that you use the example of a delivery driver is great, because one of the kind of totems in crack up capitalism for me is Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, and his main protagonist in that is a pizza delivery person who sort of travels between jurisdictions. So this is the way that Stephenson introduces us to his sort of world-making process, is the pizza person going into, the apartheid gated community, and then from there to the small rump version of the United States, to the sort of techno metaverse community, and sort of traversing very quickly a high number of diverse sort of jurisdictions.
Now we've gone through people and how you deal with the limitation of the movement of people while keeping the flow of capital and information going. So that seems to have a logic into it. But then comes the thing in between, which is goods, right? So what do you do with goods? Capital must flow, people must not flow, unless they're the right kind of people who know what the flow of capital means. But then you have this reemergence, especially with Donald Trump 2.0, of tariffs and of protectionism, something that was an absolute taboo for the globalist neoliberal. And I'm not sure even that your libertarians that you just described were very much keen on that either. So where does that come from, and how will it fit with the rest? So,
So one thing I think it's helpful to ask oneself is, what is the kind of model of economic activity that neoliberal intellectuals have in mind when they make their visions of the future, or their proposals of how to fix the problems of capitalism and democracy and tension? One of the things I sort of only realized in retrospect with globalists is that it was really mostly about trade. It was mostly about an international division of labor in which some things were manufactured some places and others other places, and you needed to create an architecture to prevent, blockages and obstacles from the movement of goods from one place to the other. The world of zones that I introduce in Crack Up Capitalism is also very much based in some ways on manufacturing. It's about the outsourcing of the supply chain out across long distances, so that with the container ship, transport costs fall basically to nothing, and you can do something even as trivial as make a t-shirt or a sweater in 3 or 4 different countries. And when it goes from country to country, it's going into mostly export processing zones. So these offshore, onshore places that are somewhat in but separate from the host country, but that allow for kind of tapping into market arbitrage, finding the lowest wage, finding the lowest site of production, and then delivering at the lowest price point to the consumer. So to think about the problem of global governance through the lens of trade, I think, offers you one set of solutions. And it's the kind I offer in Globalists, which is it can be good to have a kind of top-level framework of encasement to kind of lock in this very complex labyrinth of exchanges and supply chains. If you think about it, the problem in terms of finance and money rather than goods, then you get a kind of a different, I think, vision of how the globe should be governed. I think there, and this is one place I think you have a really important insight in rated agency, was that the neoliberals of the kind of early 20th century sort of didn't really reckon with the explosion of finance in the 1990s and early 2000s, and actually the basic ungovernability and the ways in which finance is not like trade, right? That creating money in huge quantities through private institutions, creating massive new debt instruments out of thin air, as long as you can find a customer for them, produces a kind of unwieldy sort of swirl of value, which isn't really amenable to the same kinds of institutional arrangements that can govern something that in the end is a material t-shirt that moves from one place to another. What happens when you can just click your fingers and create enormous amounts of money and thereby value in the traditional liberal sense immediately? I think that much of the chaos of the present moment is a kind of outcome of that runaway process of financialization, which produced a kind of world historical level of wealth in a small number of people, which is now sort of swamping the efforts at creating an orderly model of trade governance in the kind that the mid-century neoliberals would have hoped for. So the way that the stock market after the global financial crisis was, juiced so hard by quantitative easing, driving stocks up the way it did, mostly driven by a small number of tech stocks, producing now this overclass of a small number of incredibly wealthy tech billionaires who in effect have now been able to co-opt the government for their own means that, what's best for Tesla or Bitcoin is now becoming the question of how the United States operates. So this is a sort of a long roundabout way of getting to the tariff question, but I think that what we see now is a kind of a billionaire class, which often still does make things, but which has been, empowered to an extraordinary degree by the unleashing of unregulated finance in the last 30 years, which is now trying to figure out what kind of trade regime works best for it. One can explain, I think, the appearance of someone like Musk into the Trump campaign as an effort to kind of bear hug the potential president and prevent a kind of tariff policy that would be too detrimental to his own interests. So taking on board now that some version of the use of tariffs as an economic weapon will be part of a new Trump administration, as we already know. The desire, I think, of an Andreessen or a Musk was to make sure that this didn't hit them too hard in the markets that they really depend on. For Musk, that means China. So it's surprising already what we know that Mexico and Canada are being hit with higher tariffs than China itself. So that's, I think, part of the story here is that this sort of insurgent tech libertarian community sees tariffs now as a kind of part of governance, and they're trying to make sure that it doesn't hurt them too much. Is the tariff as an economic weapon sort of consistent with any version of neoliberal philosophy or neoliberal ideology? Basically, no. The short answer is no. The longer answer is that it depends what you're using the tariffs for. Reagan made use of aggressive, not necessarily tariff policy, but non-tariff barriers to trade, so-called voluntary export restraints, import quotas, subsidies at a high level, often for the same reason that Trump and Biden did, which is to protect the American semiconductor industry, in particular, the American automobile industry in particular, from competition from more efficient and better products. Then it was Japan, now it's China. So if you try to understand the nature of Reagan's trade policy, you would, I think, make a distinction between tariffs that are being used to open up foreign markets for American products and tariff policy that's being used to create more levels of independence and self-sufficiency. So I think if there is a kind of a neoliberal kind of tariff, it's in the model of what's been called competitive liberalization. So you use tariffs to kind of open up markets that had been previously more protected and to, increase access for your nation's own products. But even then, doctrinaire neoliberals would look very skeptically at this use of an overt economic weapon rather than, fighting it out more in the space of products and the market.
But it's a threat. In this case, it would be basically a threat to make sure that the American companies that are purchasing or have purchased part of the American state are not harmed in other countries.
Yeah.
However, that can create problems in return on the import level. And that presents a problem because, after all, neoliberalism in all its different variants have relied very much on the import of, especially in the US, of cheap products, because since the salaries, the wages are stagnant, that's the only way that you can prevent impoverishment. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the reason I think I'm kind of laboring over the answer is that I think the way it's narrated popularly is often overly clear-cut and simplistic, which is that, you know, the tariff is an old-style economic weapon. It brings us back to the 1930s or the 1890s. Therefore, it's kind of backward-looking and the opposite of free tradeism and a globalizing marketplace. Not necessarily. I think the tariffs can be used to advance economic globalization. I think that the fact that part of Trump 1 was trying to get greater enforcement of things like intellectual property rules and WTO rules inside of China shows us that, you know, sometimes this sort of aggressive tariff policy can be in service of locking in more legalized versions of free trade, right? It can be a way of getting to that endpoint. Or it can be a version of, or in the interest of decoupling and delinking from China altogether, which is a very different outcome. So I think that that's what I want to sort of draw attention to, is the tariff as a weapon that can be used for diverse purposes. And some are more acceptable to neoliberals than others. However, I think grosso modo, the tariff is a kind of a very, very volatile and dangerous weapon in the minds of neoliberals, and something that has usually worse outcomes than good outcomes. So the generalization of the tariff, which itself I would argue is an extension of the American reliance on sanctions as a way of doing foreign policy through the market rather than through diplomatic channels, is a real shift in the terrain since 2016 that has mostly worked against what mainstream neoliberals would want ideally from foreign economic policy.
And where does Robert Lighthizer fit in all that? Because he seemed to be an emerging important figure. I mean, for him, tariffs were not a threat, but were a form of industrial policy, even a form of fiscal policy, or the replacement of a fiscal policy, the possibility of a welfare state without union and without taxes. So the wing that you think is on the wane, but nonetheless, it's still there. A bad version of Lighthizer, which is Peter Navarro, is still in the administration. So,
how to think about that?
Yeah.
I mean, the beginning of the Globalist book sort of presents this moment where Alan Greenspan says, it doesn't matter anymore who is elected president because the world economy actually determines what policy will be enacted. It's hard now, I think, to put our minds back in that kind of late 90s, early 2000s mentality when politicians from left and right just took global competition and competitiveness as a kind of a natural force to which states could only respond kind of passively. You had no choice about the deindustrialization of formerly industrialized countries. You had no choice about the outsourcing and offshoring of all kinds of jobs, the shift into more precarious service work. It wasn't the politicians, it was the global economy that was holding the steering wheel, and all you could do was react. The benefit of this disruption in 2016, which I would argue was sort of led by Bernie Sanders and then co-opted by Bannon and given to Trump, is that in many ways the politics are back in political economy. I think that to be able to say that, you know, globalization is not a force of nature, but is something that is an outcome of a series of policy choices, and that we can make a different series of policy choices to produce a different kind of globalization, is, in general terms, a great advance, right? In that sense, I've always been hesitant to condemn absolutely the kind of shakeup to global economic thinking that has happened in the wake of Trump. I think the fact that Biden's administration, took on and then even accelerated many of the challenges to global free trade orthodoxy that Trump had started is a good sign that even, institutional members of the left, progressives inside the establishment, also think that we don't just want to go back to the way it was before. That had lost legitimacy. It wasn't producing the best outcomes. So we need to think again about the balance of state and market. That, I think, is healthy and great. Unfortunately, I think that balance has been used now in pernicious ways by the Trumpian right. And the vision that was arguably more amenable to left-wing outcomes that Robert Lighthizer represented, in which, at least on paper, the idea of third-party investor-state dispute settlement was being questioned. The idea that corporations could sue countries for lost profits was something he was very suspicious of, which I think is correct. He was, and people in his trade office were trying to get things like labor standards put into trade agreements so that the ability to organize in a Mexican factory, for example, would be part of an agreement that the United States would agree to. The people who took over from him in Biden's administration pushed that even farther. We're trying to think about trade agreements that would protect goals of energy transition, would protect social rights, and would help to lift up the floor for people who were part of the newly created jobs. So I don't think it was ever a question of like tariff revenue replacing taxation of a general kind. You never make enough from tariffs to do that level of spending. But the idea that the state could arrange its relationship to other trading partners in ways that could be transformative internally towards desirable social goals is wonderful, actually. I mean, we need that. We need that approach of alternative globalization. It's just a question of what those internal goals are, and those that are shared currently by the Trumpian right are all of the worst ones.
Right. So going back now, I mean, we've gone from people to capital, to goods, back to capital. Mm-hmm. As you said, the super rich class, which formed in the first neoliberal era, mm-hmm. And especially through the action of central banks. Mm-hmm. And one of the big measures or type of measure that accelerated that movement mm-hmm. was quantitative easing, mm-hmm. which developed even more as a response after the 2008 crisis, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
And yet, some of the people that you talk about, some of these libertarians or paleo-libertarians mm-hmm. that seem to have a voice and a place mm-hmm. in the Trump family circle,
yeah.
Are very much against that.
Right.
Very much against quantitative
sure.
easing, are very suspicious of central bank.
Yeah.
And what they are sort of doing is two things, which
mm-hmm.
is also, we'll come back to that later,
mm-hmm.
is looking at the past and looking at the future at the
yeah.
same time. What they want to push instead is, on the one hand, a return to gold standard, mm-hmm. and on the other hand, the development of cryptocurrency, mm-hmm. Which would be development of Hayek's fascination for private money and mm-hmm. private creation of money. Mm-hmm. So how does that fit, and how does that work with, something that was working pretty well for mm-hmm. the billionaire class
right.
that is supporting Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I remember a few years ago when Adam Tooze published his book about the global financial crisis crashed, which was a kind of a great forensic dissection of the decision-making processes inside of the Obama administration and how they ended up really coming to a very sweet handshake deal with the financial sector that basically gave them all they wanted, but then also obviously bailed them out in great scale. He says at the beginning of it that his book was going to help explain also the return of the far right and the rise of the far right. And it never quite got there, mm-hmm. but in time, I think I've been able to see how he's sort of helping to set a set of explanations, indeed, for the far right. And you can look at that in a couple of different national contexts. So someone like Steve Bannon openly sees the Tea Party as the kind of starting gun for what became MAGA. And the Tea Party was launched by a bunch of people that were very angry about the terms of the Obama, Hank Paulson, Goldman Sachs friendly bailout. They thought that it rewarded kind of bad actors. It rewarded people who didn't have the money that they claimed that they did. He thought that it rewarded the financial actors who were just out for a short-term commission and engaged in what was effectively like a Ponzi scheme. And so there was a problem of like too much liquidity had been inserted into the financial system, and you needed to somehow get a hold of that and subject people more to like the hard logic of, you know, prudential standards and kind of fiscal responsibility. So how do you do that, right? Like how do you squeeze people back into more responsible actors who are punished when they make the wrong economic decisions, rather than always being able to land in the soft pillow of federal bailout if you're positioned correctly? There's basically, you know, now, as you say, two ways of enforcing austerity and deflation in money terms. Well, there's more than two, but two of the most exotic ones that are interesting to the libertarians is one is go back to gold. So this idea that the beginning of the end was the closing of the gold window by Nixon in 1971, and the embrace of fiat currency, meaning a kind of endless ability for private actors to produce money with always the hope and understanding that the Fed would be the lender of last resort and the dealer of last resort to backstop, you know, an increasingly large and unwieldy financial system, is for them like the romantic fall from grace that ended a particular kind of morality. It ended a particular kind of self-control and self-governance, which supposedly reigned before 1971. And afterwards, now we're in the era of everyone being parasitical in different ways on the fiat money model.
A remarkable thing there, just an interjection, is that one of the main person who sort of smoothed the rulings once the Keynesian post-war order was destroyed was Milton Friedman, who was, you know, commissioned by the Nixon administration to do that. So there's an interesting...
Absolutely. And this is one of the many places where it pays off actually to study these otherwise seemingly very small internal conversations among neoliberals, because the rifts that exist in that group are actually often quite consequential. So there was a huge division inside of the neoliberal intellectual community about whether it was a good idea to embrace fiat currency or if you needed to stay on some version of the gold standard. There was a big debate about whether you should have fixed exchange rates or floating exchange rates. It's a great book by Matthias Schmelzer, which will be published in English this year, that gets into those precise internal debates. But what I think is so interesting for me is that traditionally people would, if asked, might say, well, what's neoliberalism? Well, I guess it's like the financialization of everything and, you know, the unleashing of like huge geysers of money and central banks sort of acting as the new governing entities for the globe, and Wall Street kind of running everyone's lives and asset managers running capitalism. And that's certainly one definition of neoliberalism. And there were neoliberals who embraced the moment of fiat money creation. I mean, Milton Friedman would be one, as long as it was governed by some kind of rule. But there's this kind of dissident wing of the neoliberal movement, which has become more and more powerful over time, who always thought that fiat money was what they called monetary socialism. So that all of this, and central banks included, were kind of like the new enablers for ever less productive, ever more dependent version of social life. So if you want to go back to gold, what does that mean? I mean, the first question is if you're serious or not, because I think the threat to go back to gold is often simply a way to try to discipline the demands of populations that are seen as, you know, asking too much. So you say, no, we're going to go back to gold. That means that they will radically shrink the money supply. There'll be way less money to go around. And all of these expenditures that states have will no longer be possible. And basically, it'll be a hard stop on anything but the core functions of the state. It'll be radically disinflationary. Credit basically won't exist anymore. And life will become actually much more austere for almost everybody. And some libertarians really do cultivate that vision. Actually, one quite striking literary reconstruction of this is in Lionel Shriver's book, The Mandibles, which comes from her own libertarian philosophy, which envisions a kind of economic crash in the United States based on, excessive money creation. And there's a free state of Nevada, which returns to a gold standard, which becomes for her like the last bastion of rationality. But it's also like a highly simplified economy without access to all of the things that credit makes possible. So there is a curious overlap between sort of visions of austere, almost anarcho-primitivism, and the actual realization of a gold bug style economy, because it would have to be much more simple. So that's why I think we should best understand language of gold bugs as less a genuine desire to return to that, and more as a kind of rhetorical strategy to discipline people who want to continue, expanding the money supply for reasons of credit and also potentially other reasons of state spending. And gold is actually more like what Bitcoin is, which is a kind of an asset that can be used to hedge against other parts of the economy's fluctuations. So people are buying gold, in fact, in record numbers now. The price of gold keeps going up and up. The central banks of the world are hoarding gold in ways that they hadn't for years. This seems to be, for some people, a sign that we're cracking up and will return to nations that have their own kind of gold-based currency. But actually, it's a sign of the ongoing kind of vitality of the global capitalist system, that they're gathering these things to hedge against fragmentation, but they understand that it's going to continue to be, robust and healthy, and there will not actually be a return to sort of Lionel Shriver-style free states of Nevada across the landscape. The reason I think Bitcoin is so interesting in this light is that I think similarly, there's especially now a kind of split in the crypto community between, you could say, like the true believers who think that you can take Bitcoin not as an endpoint, but as a basis for kind of a blockchain, trustless version of creating a ledger of decision making within which the rules can be set in some ways, but you can also use them to make decisions about other forms of collective governance. So there are kind of utopian communities of libertarians who believe that so-called decentralized autonomous organizations are possible in a way that is more amenable to privacy, less amenable to state oversight, less amenable to private surveillance, and that can offer a kind of online version of libertarian self-organization. These people are out there. In many cases, they were the ones who pioneered these technologies. But we're at a really interesting tipping point, I think, with cryptocurrency, where its embrace by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, the most powerful man in the world, has unleashed maybe the least principled parts of the cryptocurrency model, which is the meme coin, also known as the shit coin, meaning you do enormous high publicity drops of a new currency. Early investors flood in and the price goes through the roof, and then the smart investors pull out at the peak, and a so-called rug pull means that the value then collapses. On the day of the inauguration, Trump released a meme coin called Dollar Trump. Mm-hmm. Dollar Melania was also released. These ones we know about. The one that you don't hear as much about is the pastor who gave the sermon saying that Trump was realizing Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of a world, where we were judged by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. Also had a meme coin that dropped that day, Dollar Lorenzo coin, So this proliferation of it as simply a form of casino capitalism and gambling, rather than the basis for like an alternative small-scale reconstruction of the social contract, which some people actually were and still are working on, has produced a kind of split where some of the true believers are now feel alienated from the Trumpian co-option of the Bitcoin model. But I think crypto has done its work ideologically already with a lot of the voting public, especially the young voting public, to produce a sense of volatility, get rich quick possibilities, and this idea that all you have to do is like focus and grind and do the research, and you too can go to the moon by the fruits of your efforts, never leaving, the comfort of your own laptop. I thought Steve Bannon had an interesting quote recently where when asked to defend his extreme migration policy, he said, "I think that we should get rid of all immigrants and stop immigration. Absolutely. Why? Because every American should have the chance to grab the brass ring." And that's a kind of like slightly obscure reference, but in the olden days, there was a carousel that went around. You rode a little mechanical horse, and there was a brass ring that you could reach for. Not everyone would grab it. It was effectively a jackpot. Some people would get the ring and others wouldn't. It was basically a matter of luck. And I thought, to me, that was such an interesting way to defend the American model. It's not, getting the fruits of your labor or like all of the work that you put in, but it's really just like everyone should have a chance to win the lottery. That's effectively what he's saying, which is like a really strange revision of the American dream, but one I think consistent with a primarily scam-based economy that characterizes a lot of the United States right now.
Well, it should be your birthright to drop a meme coin.
That's
for
right.
every American.
Yes, exactly.
Which means that it's that. I mean, both gold and crypto develops this imaginary of a fully disciplined world, because the quantity of money would exceed right what the crypto authorizes or what gold authorizes.
Yeah.
But this exists only as a speculative proposition, that it's on the verge of happening, maybe, and so therefore it is the time to invest in gold, or it's the time to invest in crypto, because that may happen. But it's kind of purely speculative. So it also echoes the tariff thing, which exists mostly as a threat, as a possibility of a completely reordained world around borders and national borders. So it's an interesting way in which the speculative aspect of another world on the verge of happening is folded back into the financialized capitalism that we've had in the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I've taken from your work is the way that I think a lot of financial logics end up sort of seeping into forms of political mobilization and the imagination even of social movements. And the Hayek's Bastards book, I would say, is sort of based on a sort of Michel Feher-like intuition, which is that the nature of the far-right politics can be understood in some ways as a kind of what's called in financial circles a flight to safety. So in times of volatility, when fears of kind of excessive liquidity, then people will return to things that are seen as safe investments, assets that hold their value and have been proven to hold their value over the decades or even centuries. The classic one is gold, but other ones I suggest are whiteness, territory, right? The idea that places and people can be something that can offer stability in tumultuous and highly volatile times. And I think that crypto is a perfect example of this, because Bitcoin offers that sense of finitude, stability. There's only X number of Bitcoins, 36,000 minted, and there will not be more. So if you're worried about the world going out of control and central banks, not being able to govern financialization, then here is like an island of order and stability that you can land on. And yet the way that cryptocurrency has now panned out is literally the opposite. It's like the most ungoverned, ridiculous, constantly proliferating model of value that is actually not value because no one can sell their Melania coin at the rate that they had bought it at. There's nowhere to actually perform that realization of value. So I think that is maybe, one way to understand this sort of chaotic dynamic of the far right is like a search for stability on paper, which then pans out as a kind of ungovernable inflationary loss of control over the very sense of value that you thought you were pinning down when you voted for Brexit to take back control. This is kind of a desire to say, okay, enough is enough. Let's return sovereignty inside of national borders. Itself not an unreasonable demand as far as I'm concerned, but then it misunderstood what the project actually was, which was actually to further expose the UK to the ungovernable energies of global competition and make that sense of control even more distant. That's the square that I think has not been figured out so far.
But pushing it further, I heard you recently say that in fact the meme coins and cryptocurrency was kind of the new industrial policy. In other words, it was first about, in Trump 1, it was about reshoring industries and rebuilding that. And so, the whole flirtation with Lighthizer and his policies at the time was all about bringing back jobs and industry in the Rust Belt. At this point, it seems to be given up. And instead, what you can do is drop your meme coin, or at least admire those who have the possibility of doing so.
Yeah, and perhaps in an ideal world, you could use, let's say, the drive up of the value of Bitcoin to help finance something like the building out of nuclear power stations for your new AI data centers. That's really the best case scenario, is there could be some kind of constructive relationship between like extremely speculative crypto markets and then something that is a bit more tangible and real. But more likely, I think, is that you just get the former and not the latter. I think the discovery of Trump 1 is that it's hard to make things. It's hard to reindustrialize the Midwest. They didn't try very hard. Biden actually tried. I mean, there were tens of thousands of infrastructure projects. There was the biggest investment bill in American history to try to kickstart a kind of green energy transition through huge subsidies for, battery producers, windmill producers, electric vehicle manufacturers. And that too sort of didn't have a political payoff. So the lesson for a politician could be that the time horizon for actually transforming the built material economy just exceeds the 2 or 4 year election cycle. So why not do something that gives people instant gratification in a sense that they might get that brass ring, tomorrow instead of when their children are teenagers or whatever. So I think that radical shrinking of the horizons of gratification that out of control financialization has normalized is something that also stands in the way of the proper material transformations necessary to obviously confront a world especially characterized by climate change and also, hyper precarity. And that's the jealousy of the Chinese model, right? I mean, that's the envy that people like Thiel have, is that they can operate over longer time horizons because they're not bothered with the sort of the obstacle every 2 years of a new election.
Yeah, so the choice from their point of view is either you stick to meme coins and that kind of instant brass ring gratification, or you undo what's left of electoral democracy once and for all, and then you have a longer time frame to do the Chinese thing.
I think that's right. I mean, I think one of the things people get wrong about the Trump philosophy and the MAGA movement is that because it has the word America in it, and you see a lot of American flags around, that this is somehow like a top-level national project. I don't think it is. I think if realized, the policy of the Trump administration actually guts central government. It guts the possibility of national level funding of anything, let alone coordination of anything. And it kicks a lot of that energy back to the states and then to cities and counties below that. Within those much smaller spaces, then I do think people like Joe Lonsdale in Texas, Peter Thiel in Florida, can have the hope of, creating an electoral bloc so locked into their interests that maybe you can build out something across 2 years and 4 years. Maybe actually, make your rockets. Like if we believe Musk, then he's not in it for just meme coins or lols.
Right.
Supposedly he's in it for something that will take, 10, 20, 30 years, which is building out the infrastructure to colonize other planets.
Right.
So that's another way of understanding, I think, the decentralizing energy of MAGA is that perhaps with small, more fortified, self-governed enclaves, you can actually create a more corporate type managerial rule that, as you mentioned before, uses the more decisionist power of executives rather than the legalized tool of kind of the same rules for everybody to, realize more specific goals. I think one of the things that's really come home to me, comparing the world of globalists to the world of crack-up capitalism, is the question of what kind of empire this better resembles. So I think a false understanding of what empire is that it's a homogeneous rule of law, enveloping the earth. In fact, real existing empire in the 19th century was highly pluralistic. It offered many different opportunities for taking advantage of the laws in a treaty port versus a concession versus the metropole. And capitalism actually expanded across the decades, not by having one world court for capitalism, but by having many, many different regions that it could operate between and maximize sort of outcomes within. And I think one of the things we're seeing in this turn from globalism to kind of secessionism or crack-up is a kind of rediscovery of actually the 19th century real existing mercantilist empires and all of the sort of freebooting entrepreneurial experimentation that happened there, rather than what now looks like a kind of interlude where, for some reason, briefly, Americans, against their own history, believed it was a good idea to govern the world according to one law.
And then we wonder, because one of the basic change that was the last of my fourfold point, one of the basic changes that we see from the globalist era to the current era, the very current era, is the fact that for the globalists, the idea was this encasing and basically betting on legislation and the legislative power that was going to smooth capital. What we seem to have on steroid like never before is the executive privilege, right? So you have the destruction of the administrative state, that's the project of Project 2025, the destruction of the regulatory state, and the politicization of the state. And which means that basically executive privilege reigns supreme. So Trump is not the first one. It started with Reagan, Dick Cheney. There's even a film about that, Vice, which is all about that, the unitary executive theory. But it's pushed to an extent that would never existed before. So the question is, what is the purpose? And that's where your paradox comes back again. I mean, it's executive privilege in the name of a future decentralization, in a way. Yes, and nonetheless, there's an extra thing there, which is the fact that the cronies who seem to be on top for the moment, Musk in particular, but not only, seem to have a slightly different fantasy, which is no longer to have their own private zone in the state, but why not have the entire state in a way, or to make the state into their slush fund?
Yeah, no, and I think you can have both. So I think that, for Peter Thiel, indeed, the arc of my book, The Crack-Up Capitalism, begins with Thiel saying in 2009, the only way to do politics now is to exit, imagining a kind of a world of many thousands of polities instead of just about 200 countries. So the idea of a kind of endless movement between jurisdictions based on what you wanted, what you needed out of them, and so on. by 2016, only 7 years later, he's speaking at the Republican National Convention and seems indeed to have concluded that it's easier to take over an existing state than to go off and create your own. So I think there is that aspect to it. And the old-fashioned military-industrial complex is indeed being realized as a kind of tech-industrial complex, as Biden suggested in his farewell address. But I think also that to stop at that vision of state capture as the kind of endpoint of their politics is not going far enough if you want to understand even their own thought processes. That if you take seriously which I think we have to now, the effort to completely sort of decapitate and defang the administrative state and to reduce it to a few privileges or obligations, including, writing the checks for Palantir and Anduril and SpaceX. In other words, filling the contracts with this small number of, very highly specialized tech services. Then you have to see that there's a step after state capture, which is maybe something more like state exit. And for Musk, that means, on the one hand, going vertical, going to the stars, but also more short-term, it means going inside and producing processes of internal secession and breakup. And I think that is very consistent with the writings, for example, of someone who I've long felt was exaggerated in his influence, but I'm now starting to feel like maybe was properly estimated in his influence, and that's Curtis Yarvin, who was blogging for years under the name Mencius Moldbug. Just got a big profile in the New York Times a few weeks ago. And he spoke of something that he called neo-cameralism or neo-reaction, which was kind of based on some principles which look pretty familiar if you are looking at the operations of the Silicon Valley right at the moment. The first was what he called rage, which was retire all government employees. So he felt like a newly elected government should immediately retire all government employees. And in fact, that's literally what Elon Musk tried to do recently when he sent an email identical to the one he sent to his Twitter employees saying, if you want to retire, send back a response, resign in the email body, and you'll receive severance until September. Go somewhere nice, enjoy yourself, have a good life. No legal authority to do this, no constitutional ability to do this, and yet bringing into reality this otherwise very speculative, strange thing that Curtis Yarvin had suggested. What else did he suggest? He suggests that the better model for governance is not democracy, but monarchy, which is something that Hans Hermann Hoppe, the student of Murray Rothbard, also suggests. Again, seems wild, seems outlandish, seems like science fiction, but he uses the example of Dubai. And he says, who's the hero of the political economy globally in the 2000s? The Emirates, Dubai in particular. What is it? It's a hereditary autocracy, clan-based rule, very old-fashioned seeming, combined with tapping into the most cutting-edge spaces of entertainment, real estate, manufacturing, finance. So Elon Musk's own description of himself as techno-king of Tesla obviously suggests there is some complementarity there. But the third thing that Yarvin is known for is his idea of so-called patchwork. So he describes also this vision of cracked up legacy nation states governed more like these sort of corporate style enclaves. He uses the idea of SovCorp, so sovereign corporation, meaning what it sounds like, a fusion of private power with public authority so that things are governed along bottom line CEO principles rather than the principle of universal suffrage or one person, one vote representation. And that is, at least for the present moment, I think, not a bad description of the kind of marching orders or animating vision that the United States government is increasingly operating by at the top level. And the Republican foot soldiers and the Democratic opposition have shown no ability to respond in ways that are, putting any brakes on that vision. The Supreme Court by now is tipped completely towards being the enablers for Trump's policies, so they're unlikely to push back consequentially at any of this either. So there, I think we've moved into even a different phase beyond that of kind of the world of the WTO on the one hand, special economic zones on the other one. But now if you do get a kind of version of private secessionism combined with the remnants of public authority, then we're more in the world of kind of snow crash and neo-reaction than anything.
Which goes then to the a next element, which is the way Trump 2.0, contrary to Trump 1.0, is this strange articulation of what still remains MAGA. So this kind of nostalgia for a world that never existed and the going back. And the techno-futurism, which is there. So how these two are articulated. Also, one wing that of Trumpism that we haven't talked about very much, which is mostly represented by Scott Bessent, the finance secretary, are the private equities. So basically the plunderers, right? And so I wonder, escapism means a lot of things. Escapism means escaping the state and creating your own private zone. But if the private equity continue to do their job in destroying the planet, escapism can be seen in the pure Muskian way of, you know, once the Earth is destroyed, we go to Mars. So how does the past, cultivation of the past, which is also a meme coin, I mean, it's also very speculative, right? It's how you, after get your base to approve, operate with this sort of techno-futurism and techno-escapism that develops.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, because I think he's an example of someone who draws actually more of a commonality with Trump 1. Trump 1 also governed largely with people drawn from Wall Street, people like Steve Mnuchin, Gary Cohn, Scott Bessent, and Howard Lutnick are also people from Wall Street. But they're not just from Wall Street in a vague sense, nor are they even from the kind of asset managing part of Wall Street. For the most part, in that version of Trump and this version of Trump, you have a lot of people from the so-called distressed debt sector. So this is not, you know, people doing, you know, managing pensions or doing kind of long-term investments in what they think are highly sustainable sectors of the economy. It's more like people from the world of hedge funds and in the case of Wilbur Ross, his former Commerce Secretary, bankruptcy lawyer, literally, who are trying to figure out ways to turn companies that are not producing enough value into more productive companies, either by buying them up cheap and then stripping out assets and selling them off even cheaper, or doing what are called workarounds or turnarounds by, you know, transforming usually the workforce primarily and the kind of set of assets that the company might own, sell them off and sort of unbundle the corporation into its component parts. Another really interesting comment from Steve Bannon recently was that he defended this ongoing sort of assault on the federal state and the federal budget in terms of his own Harvard Business School training. So, and he said, you know, I was trained at Harvard Business School. I did turnarounds at Goldman Sachs. I know what needs to be done to a failing company to bring it back to profitability. And that's the same logic that he's bringing to, you know, the highest level of governance. One of the many ways where I think there isn't as much distance between the super corporate minded Silicon Valley or Wall Street people in Trump's coalition and someone like Bannon. I think he just sort of uses different language to get to the same place. So I think that is, first of all, like a short-term vision that is often about, you know, shedding surplus labor, trimming things that are seen as useless. Javier Milei's budgets in Argentina are a good example of this. You know, you slash scientific funding, you slash cultural funding, you reduce pensions and wages, because these are all, I guess, just the froth and the unnecessary parts of society. And then you drill down and concentrate on things that will improve your credit rating and make your lenders happier. So that, I think, still remains maybe the core of what's going on with MAGA, actually. But at the same time, of course, you're right that what Musk gives them, what Sam Altman gives them, is a much more high-flown language of saving humanity, either through colonizing Mars, which Trump mentioned directly in his inaugural address, or in more concrete terms, doing massive investments into artificial intelligence, which has now been described as a Cold War in such ways that are designed to kind of open the taps of maximal state spending and to give the private sector the impression that if they fund AI to the maximum extent, the state will be there as a backstop for whatever kind of investments they're doing. So there is this now kind of distant future threat that's been created of, let's be honest, it's like the computers run amok, becoming self-aware and somehow, I guess, wiping out humanity. That's actually how AI people talk about the danger. Concretely, it's China somehow acting as the unwilling or willing enablers for that future destruction of humanity by Skynet-style, cyber enemies, non-human digital enemies. So that is now part of our everyday discourse in quite extraordinary ways. It's not just about 1 year out, 10 years out, it's about a millennium out. And meanwhile, what's bracketed is the much more concrete transformations of the conditions of human life brought about by climate change. You could say this fixation on the reign of Skynet that's coming, the killer robots, is almost like a displacement of all of the real anxiety that we have about accelerating killer storms and highly disruptive weather cycles onto something that is much more abstract. There is ambient anxiety and it needs somewhere to go, so it goes there and it gets utilized by Silicon Valley investors as a way to pad their wallets and their budgets. But at the same time, indeed, there's this kind of look backwards, sometimes not to the 1950s, but in the case of someone like Chris Hegseth, again to the Middle Ages, Cross of Jerusalem tattooed on his chest, slogan from the Crusades tattooed on his arm. And there we're once again in a fight for civilization, but instead of the US against China over the future AI, who gets to stop the killer robots or make them first? It's about Christendom versus Islam. And what we know about the history of Western ideas of Islam is who Islam is tends to transform over the decades and centuries. Sometimes it's literal Muslims, and sometimes it's simply a fear of a vague, distant, non-Western other. In this case, paradoxically for the United States, that threat seems to come from south of the border, manifestly part of the Western hemisphere too. So there's, I think, all of these kind of like swirling, phantasmagoric fears of the future, fantasies of the past, that I think we know possess the imagination of the top level of the lawmakers and elite in the United States. The question that I often have is about more ordinary Americans and at what point they get lost in this sort of, bewildering attempt to square the circle of medievalism and techno-futurism, and whether they are in on this, whether they're seduced by it, whether they're alienated by it, but just going along with it. I have to wonder if things continue along like the path of maximal weirdness that they're on right now, at what point that doesn't end up having kind of counterproductive effects on the GOP's own legitimacy. It will depend on things as banal as the price of gas at the gas station, obviously, the presence or absence of eggs in the grocery store, and so on. But we're at a point where the kind of distinction between the utter kind of sort of kaleidoscopic, almost psychedelic quality of the ideology of the governing elite feels so distant from the everyday needs of ordinary working people that I wonder if that gap will produce political problems at some point.
At the same time, that gap has been around for a while, and at this point they're popularity seem to be still swelling to a certain extent.
It is true, and there are all kinds of like connective tissues between the world that they inhabit and those of average Americans. Not for nothing that Trump appeared on all of the multi-hour podcasts as that kind of sign of his own connection to average people and so on. So yeah, it's true. We don't know.
And you were talking about, and then to end on something that is not exactly lighter, you were talking about, of course, the destruction of science and culture, but there is another culture that's on the rise that's going to replace it, headed by the new Secretary of Education, which is wrestling. I mean, yeah, that kind of wrestling. And so you seem to be conveying that this kind of encapsulates the present moment, so it would be interesting to...
Sure. Yeah, so the appointed head of the Department of Education, which has not yet been confirmed, but almost certainly will be, is Linda McMahon, who was for a long time helping to run the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, later became called Worldwide Wrestling Entertainment, along with her husband, Vince McMahon. And in the process, they turned Worldwide Wrestling into a really enormous corporation, actually brought it back from near bankruptcy at certain points, and fused it recently, partially because of Vince McMahon's need to avoid the many, many lawsuits he faces of sexual harassment, fused it with the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which is a kind of Brazilian jiu-jitsu mixed martial arts, which has been extremely popular in the United States, especially since COVID. Because in a kind of too good to be true anecdotal moment, UFC was relocated to an artificial island off the coast of Abu Dhabi called Fight Island, where they were free from COVID restrictions and could then stream into the homes of all the people who were stuck at home and otherwise unable to watch the usual professional sports that they enjoyed. So I think it's kind of meaningful to look at wrestling and MMA fighting, because the labor model and the workforce model that is used in those so-called sports is an extreme one. There's no union representation. There's no promise of health care or unemployment insurance. There's no retirement insurance. There's often an absolutely brutal schedule of work. So for years and years, wrestlers, even at the absolute top of the game, the Hulk Hogans and Bret Harts, they fought almost every day of the year. They only had a few days off, literally 7 days a week, 50 weeks a year. So that understanding of what work is, you go in, you sacrifice your body, you expose yourself to maximum risk, you try to build your image and build up your brand as much as possible. And when you can't do it anymore after your dozens of surgeries, you just kind of collapse, hopefully, into some amount of savings, or else poverty in your retirement. The number of wrestlers who die before the age of 40 is very high. Many of them kill themselves or kill other people in the process because of brain damage they've suffered through CTE and multiple concussions. So for me, it's a very bleak but also symptomatic vision of the American idea of work, labor, value, prominence, identity, and the fact that it remains this kind of pole for people's attraction and sort of charismatic, magnetic interest is pretty dark insight, I think, into the nature of American capitalism right now. The fact that Linda McMahon, who incidentally played a role frequently in the ring as a character, as the wife of Mr. McMahon, her husband, and frequently had to appear to be drugged because the storyline was that her husband was cheating on her, so he would be making out with a woman in front of her drugged self in a wheelchair, simulating kind of catatonia. She'll now be the head of the Department of Education and will likely oversee its dismantlement, meaning public education is already highly unequal in the United States. It's totally funded almost entirely by local property taxes, but it is leveled out a bit through federal funding for poor schools, federal funding for special education, special needs students, and then federal funding for scholarships for poor students to go to university. Eliminating the Department of Education is you even remove that tiny safety net that exists in public education, and the divisions that exist between geographies and school districts in the United States gets even more extreme. One step further is that there have been vouchers introduced now in Wisconsin and to be introduced in Florida and elsewhere, which allow people to use their tax money to go to non-public schools, so religious schools, private schools, thus further, I think, like eroding a basic socializing institution that makes people feel like they're part of one nation or community. Instead, it becomes totally opt-in, opt-out, and accelerates what some libertarians and I call in this book soft secessions, so sort of opting out of shared public institutions and choosing them privately. So what's happening is perhaps, a production of ever greater inequality towards a goal of profiling yourself as someone, with the craziest appearance and the craziest physique who can then, sacrifice your life in a ring for the enrichment of the owner.
Great way to end.
Look at all the lovely people.